All right, well, welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our speaker series hosted by the Center for Public Safety and Justice. I'm James McElvain, an assistant professor in the University of Virginia's Master of Public Safety program. Today's topic is, does education matter in policing? Before we hear from our panel of speakers, I'd like to start with a brief statement to provide some context for today's discussion. The role of education in policing has been a national conversation for nearly a century now. From the 1931 Wickersham Commission to the 1967 President's Commission on Law Enforcement, and more recently, the 2015 Task Force on 21st Century Policing, we've heard consistent calls for higher education and professional development for police officers. Yet here we are again today, still asking this same question. As police departments encounter complex challenges from community trust to constitutional accountability, the need to reimagine how we train our officers for modern policing becomes increasingly urgent. And this raises several questions. Questions such as, what defines educational training? What role does the community get to play in shaping police education? And how do we evaluate the effectiveness of the training programs once they're implemented? And the list can continue on. These questions seek to enhance the discussion on effectively and equitably preparing officers for their roles in modern policing, emphasizing practical, community-oriented, and adaptive strategies. So let me pause here just for a moment to acknowledge our online audience. If anyone has any questions for our panel members throughout this discussion, please feel free to submit them in the chat at any time. And we'll keep an eye on them and do our best to address as many as possible toward the end of the discussion. Now I'd like to introduce our panel. We're fortunate today to be joined by three panelists who bring distinct and insightful perspectives. From academy training and entry into policing, to law enforcement leadership, to lived experiences on the ground, as well as the world of academia. Our panelists today include Rosa Brooks, professor at Georgetown Law School, Oscar Odom III, associate professor at the University of Virginia, and one of my colleagues, and Christopher Easton, assistant chief of police at the University of Virginia Police Department, and a graduate of our Master of Public Safety program about a year ago. Our goal today is not to resolve this issue, but to examine the various perspectives, experiences, and evidence that shape this significant issue. I'll guide this discussion with a few questions and then reserve some time toward the end for audience participation. But before we dive into our first question, I'd like to give each of our panelists a moment to introduce themselves and share how their backgrounds relate to this topic of education in policing. And if you don't mind, Professor Brooks, I'd like to start with you.
Oh, I was afraid you were going to say that. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. As some of you know, I started my own teaching career at the University of Virginia Law School and spent 5 years there. And so it's fantastic to be back in a UVA setting, even if it's virtual. So I'm a law professor, as you said, but most obviously relevant here, I spent 5 years as a reserve police officer in Washington, D.C. with the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. And before that, I had various encounters ranging from back in law school working for the Manhattan DA's office, which brought me into close contact with a lot of NYPD officers at the time, and then working as a human rights researcher and for the U.S. Department of State and then the U.S. Department of Defense, which also, in a funny way, ended up bringing me into contact with a lot of efforts to think about policing in other countries, particularly in countries that were transitioning to democracy or that were in post-conflict settings. So I ended up working with police organizations in places as varied as the Balkans to Afghanistan and South Africa, which somewhat informs how I think about policing here in this country today.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. Next, I'll go to Dr. Odom.
Yes, thank you. I'm an associate professor of public safety at the University of Virginia. I'm also a retired NYPD detective, in which I served over 20 years with the New York City Police Department in various assignments, from the Intelligence Division, Career Criminal Unit, Fugitive Enforcement Division, Juvenile Crime Squad, and a police academy instructor, in which I've trained over thousands of officers throughout my career. Also, I served as a four-star chief and first deputy commissioner of the New York City Sheriff's Office. There, also, I was in charge of the New York City Sheriff's Training Academy. So I had a chance to do training at both NYPD and also at the New York City Sheriff's Academy. My background, I have a law degree and I also have a doctorate in education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Odom. Next, Assistant Chief Easton, please introduce yourself. And
Yeah, good afternoon. Just want to start by saying thanks for having me, and just to be on this panel with with you all is just amazing. So I appreciate being asked to be here. I started with the UVA Police Department in 2001. Went to patrol. I spent about 4 years on patrol on midnight shift, and then was in investigations for a while. We, as you can imagine, are not the size of NYPD, so we didn't have specialized units like that. But we covered everything, everything that came our way. I did that for about 5 years, and then promoted up through the ranks. And in 2022, I was promoted to assistant chief, which is where I am now. In 2021, I actually graduated with my BIS degree. So went through the police department up until 2021 without being a college graduate. So 2021, graduated with my BIS degree. 2022, I had the opportunity and attended the FBI National Academy. It was a great experience. And then upon completion of that, in 2024, I completed my master's of public safety. Proud to say I am a double who, and just again, proud to be here.
yeah, thank you very much. I think what each of you shared really sets a nice stage for the conversation ahead. So I want to begin with a foundational question, and I'll set this up a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier, calls for better educated officers has persisted since way back in 1931. And I mentioned a moment ago, here we are still having the same question about does education matter? So for each of you, here's the question. What do you perceive as the primary obstacles to advancing education in policing, and what actions are necessary to advance this conversation? So this time, let me start with Dr. Odom.
Yes. First of all, education is important to everyone, no matter what the profession is. And the professions such as public safety, key. So many different incidents are taking place across the country that demands education for our officers. Some of the things or the obstacles or problems that we have, limitations on funding, resistance to change, lack of support from leadership, workforce shortages, and the political climate. All of these things play a role in it. And of course, to flip those, we need, of course, increased funding. We need some sort of leadership commitment, flexible training opportunities, and highlight the value of education. Education is so important. Everything basically that we do, or you look at different agencies, requires some form of education. No agency across the country says become an officer, and you don't need any education whatsoever. Some education is required.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Odom. Let's next go to Assistant Chief Easton.
Yeah, so as I've gotten older and progressed through my career, I've come to realize that that there's a mentality within our profession, and of it's kind of a us versus them mentality. And what I mean by that is there's law enforcement professionals, and then there are the public, and it happens from both sides. And we need to get away from that. And law enforcement is kind of self-contained. They train together, they learn together, and a lot of times only together. So you know, some of the closest friends are police officers' closest friends are other police officers. The people they hang out with mostly are police officers or people in law enforcement. And so when there are conversations happening, when I talk about the us versus them mentality, there are when there are conversations happening either among police officers or even among public, they refer to the others as them or they, like it's the opposing side. Why is this? I don't know. Well, I mean, I can speculate. I think we can all speculate, but are police and community members, are they afraid of being judged by the other side? Is that why? Are they, I don't know. I think we need to find better answers to these to move forward in a better way, and just gain acceptance of each other. I think that's a barrier. I do think that can get in the way. Another barrier that I was one for me is people tend to get in their own way. I was in my own way for many, many years. I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I could go to school. I didn't think that I was capable. I didn't think, I was confident as a police officer. I felt like I was a good police officer. I felt like I was successful, but I didn't think I could. I didn't see myself as a college graduate. Wanted to be one, but I just didn't see it happening. I just didn't have so um, not to get too personal, but I came from a broken home. I didn't have a lot of support, and I didn't know there were opportunities out there. So how do we, and I don't know that a lot of people that were in my life at a young age recognized that and knew that. And so that's something else that I think we need to do better at, is making sure that young people know that there are opportunities out there and that they can do it, that they are capable of doing it, and that they're not alone in thinking that they can't.
Yeah, that's really good. And so you said, getting younger people to think about this, but I would even add, you're someone that's not young anymore, right? And you continued on with your education, and recently, finished a master's degree, just last year. So how do we pave that way? From what I'm hearing you say, how can we pave that way that while people might not really see that path for them, how do we then collectively show them that path? Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Next, Professor Brooks.
Yeah, I think education's hugely important. I mean, obviously, that's my profession. I'm a professional higher ed person, but also I always hate the term training. You train a dog, right? Training implies that it's just a matter of kind of, conditioning people to, fill out the right form, sit when I tell you to sit, stay when I tell you to stay, bark when I tell you to bark, whatever. And nobody's like that. Humans aren't like that. I mean, I don't think there are any humans who don't want education in the broadest sense, right? That education in the broadest, most ideal sense it's about thinking critically. It's about asking questions. It's about being empathetic. It's about learning to be creative as a problem solver. It's about learning to be innovative. It's about always asking not just how do I do this or what do I do, but why do we do this, and could we do it differently? Should we do it differently? How might we go about changing it? And I, my own experience with police officers, as well as basically pretty much all humans, that's a pretty natural human tendency. Humans, we're people who ask questions. And if you put a bunch of people into a kind of academy setting where they're discouraged from that kind of thinking, and what they're told is, no, memorize this, speak when spoken to, and that's the end of it, that's frustrating to them, it's discouraging to them, and it doesn't particularly make them into the best officers they can be. So of course, I think it's hugely important that police officers have education, not just training. What are the barriers? Well, money and time, and Oscar said this, real education is more expensive and more time consuming than just training. I can train somebody to do a bunch of tasks pretty quickly, to learn a bunch of rules, learn some routines, learn some tasks. It's expensive and it's hard to create a real educational system that encourages them to think and ask questions and become critical thinkers. And money and time is something that no police department feels they have enough of, right? We always feel like, well, yeah, that would be great, but I don't have funds for that. I don't have time for that. I need these officers right there, right now, and I'll take what I can get. But those are the big barriers. But there's also another barrier, and Chris mentioned the barrier of sometimes people fear change and they don't like change, but that applies frankly to higher education, as well as to sometimes police officers. I do think that our educational system is not itself always structured in a way that is creative and innovative and that meets people where they are. That so much about our educational system has not really been fundamentally rethought in over a century. That if you go to college in this country, odds are you're going to spend a lot of time sitting in a chair, listening to a lecture, taking notes and memorizing stuff, and then being evaluated based on your ability to regurgitate material on a timed exam or do a 20-page research paper and so on. And those are, I mean, look, I'm where I am now because I'm really good at taking tests and writing papers, right? That's the one thing, like if you know nothing else about somebody who's a professor, you can assume that they were really good at those things. But those things don't necessarily mean anything about being good at anything else in the real world. I hate to say it, right? That you can be a really thoughtful, really innovative and creative critical thinker, whether as a police officer or anything else, and be just terrible at taking timed exams or writing research papers. That you may be somebody who expresses themselves better orally, than in writing. You may be somebody who freaks out if you got a timed test and so forth, but is really fantastic with humans. And I think our whole system is structured in a way that does sometimes tell people like you, Chris, yeah, you're probably not going to be able to do this thing because, but this thing is something that may have nothing to do with anything that actually matters, and I don't think that our higher education system has been very creative either, not just for when it comes to policing, but just in general, right? When it comes to saying to young people and people at all career stages, hey, there's room for you here. We can find a way to reflect back to you what makes you good at whatever it is, whether it's being an architect or whether it's being a police officer, or whether it's being a plumber, that invites you to be innovative and creative and to really think about, why do we do what we do? Can we do it better? Can we do it differently? But that doesn't require you to spend, years of your life sitting in a classroom being talked at and writing a lot of long papers, which writing a lot of long papers and taking a lot of exams makes you really good at writing papers and taking exams. And so if you want to be an academic, like those are awesome skills to have and they're really practical. If you want to be a good police officer, they may not be the most relevant skills. And so I do think that education needs to change too, that there are other ways to teach, there are other ways to learn, there are other ways to assess people's progress and to assess their understanding. And so I also think that, higher education needs to change too.
Yeah, that's excellent. As you were talking about, some of the examples, it reminded me several years back, I was a director over a police academy in Southern California. And one of the things that we talked about there was, moving more towards scenario-based training because yeah, we can teach you the basic mechanics. We can teach you the law, but you have to learn how to be a thinker because not every situation is going to be exactly the same. You need to be able to adapt to those nuances as they're unfolding. And so, to your point, you get some of that, foundation in, an academic sitting in a chair, but being able to actually put yourself in the role where things are constantly evolving improves on your ability to make decisions and at times fail forward in a safe environment. Thank you very much. So I'm going to come right back to you, Professor Brooks. So this next question is an opportunity to speak from your professional journeys and personal journeys and your perspectives. And so I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm going to make reference to one of the books that you read or had written called Tangled Up in Blue. I actually read it twice, once a couple years ago and then more recently before we had this conversation because I wanted to refresh my memory. So in the book, you describe your experience transitioning from a law professor to a reserve officer with the DC Metropolitan Police Department. So how did that experience reshape your views on the role of education in policing, and maybe even your thoughts about, you know, policing in general?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it really reinforced for me the things I was just saying. It's in the police academy, and it has improved since this time. This is now almost 10 years ago. I started the police academy in 2016, early in 2016. Um, and the nation then, as ever since, was having a conversation about policing. And lots of people were saying, it's policing, it's just racist, it's structurally racist, or, it's too violent, and police killings were in the news. And one of the things that just struck me instantly in the police academy was we weren't talking about any of those things. We were memorizing what forms to fill out for what kinds of property and, the best tactical approach to handcuffing a person who was standing versus prone versus kneeling and so on. And it was so weird, right? Because it's not as though police officers don't live in the world, right? We all live in the world. Everybody goes home at the end of the day and they're talking to their families and they're watching the news or they're on social media. So all this stuff was happening and we weren't talking about it. And it just seemed so kind of jarring. That the conversations, the sort of really fundamental, I mean, you need to do the tactical stuff. You need to know what form to use. You need to know how to put handcuffs on. You need to practice it. I mean, those are obviously important, but there are also these other really important conversations like, okay, what are we doing here? Like, what's the project of policing? What are police for? What role should they play in a democratic and diverse society? What's good policing? What do we think good policing is? Can we measure it? How do we know it when we've got it? How do we know it when we don't have it? How should police engage with those conversations about race and about racism and about poverty and about mental illness and so on? Like, how do we have those conversations? Not just what's a list of things to remember or a list of bullet points to regurgitate on the quiz, but and we weren't talking about those things, and it wasn't because people didn't care, right? It wasn't because the recruits didn't care. And I had many conversations, usually out in the hall, or outside, where you'd be talking to some other recruits and people be talking about what was in the news, or they'd be worrying about something, or they'd be frustrated about something. But there wasn't a sort of systematic way to get those conversations into the classroom and to connect them to all of the tactical stuff. And that really kind of shocked me. And it just seemed like such a lost opportunity too, that you've got these people and people, as you all know, most people who go into policing go into it for pretty idealistic reasons, right? I mean, Are there some people who go into it because they want to be a bully with a badge and a gun? Yeah, there are, but most people aren't like that. They go into it thinking, I want to help my community, I want to protect people. And if we're not then inviting them to take that energy, to take that passion and idealism, and to use it to think hard about, okay, and how do I make this profession better? And how do I be the best officer I can be and make my partners, my colleagues, the best they can be? What a waste, right? What a wasted opportunity. And that's how you then end up with officers who then feel depressed, they feel burnt out, they feel marginalized, they feel like, well, nobody cares what I think anyway, so screw you all. And you get some pretty bad stuff happening, partly because we're not inviting them to use that part of themselves that I think, everybody's got. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it did, and I really enjoyed what you were saying, and it makes me think about in our Masters of Public Safety program, we have a core class called Creating and Sustaining Community Dialogue, and I find it interesting, with what you're saying is that, here we're introducing this course at a master's level in academia, and this might be something that should be shared out at academies. And what you're describing is this silo of, we come into an environment that we're all police officers, talking to police officers, listening to police officers, and when we get to our patrol stations or work environment, again, we're still within this bubble, so to speak, and we deploy out into our communities, but we're just still an outsider of sorts. And so, creating this opportunity of bridging that gap, and there is no us versus them, kind of to what Assistant Chief Easton had mentioned earlier. Yeah, thank you very much. I'll go to Dr. Odom next. So, Oscar, with your extensive background in both law enforcement and academia, how have you seen educational advancement influence police practices or maybe even leadership development?
A lot. First of all, as stated before, and we look around the country, no one becomes a police chief without even a high school diploma. You have to have something. And if you look these days, everybody, the requirement is minimum bachelor's degrees, if not a master's degree, in order to be a chief of police any place across the country these days. And of course, that shows you the value and the importance of education. Like in our program, all of us, our professors, we're, as we call, pracademics. We combine theory and practice. All of us have been practitioners before, and now we are academics, and we combine the best of both worlds, so to speak. So when you look at this as educational advancement influence on there, enhanced decision making, when you look at these different things, it's important for leaders and police officers in general to have analytical skills, to have critical skills, because when you go out there, there's so many different issues that's taking place on the streets or in different communities when officers are out there. So it's important for the leaders to be able to give this information, talk about it, be able to speak to the community, to deal with these different things. Also, as a leader, to be able to adopt to the best practices, to look at research, what's evidence-based, what's data-driven, to help to influence the procedures and or policies that you're going to do when you're out there. And like I said, the theory and practice provides the best of both worlds. As stated before, if it's in a silo and it's only inside the classroom with only academics only, it doesn't translate out to the street, because all it is we're just talking to one another and we got all these ideas. But if it's not impacting what's going on in the real world, it's useless to a certain extent. So the fact that, as in our program, we have the students that are actually active out there, and to have these live discussions and talk about it and the best practices and what research is able to do, they're able to combine theory and practice and go out there and execute it in the real world. The creating and sustaining community dialogue course that we have is so important because of, cultural competency is so important these days when you go out there and you're dealing with different communities, or just in general, to execute and talk about different ideals, different things that are going certain places, equitable practices, how are different people and or different communities being impacted. Years ago, when I was in NYPD, when we went through the academy, we had to take this course called social science. And social science was something that taught us about all different communities in which we serve, because we had so many different communities there. How was you going to do this? And they wanted to educate us, so to speak, on how to deal with this. Improve community relations is definitely important. And education does that because you network, you talk to people, you look at new theories, new practices, what are taking place. Also, the ability of this, the education thing, the ability to be able to adapt to change. That's so important because things are flexible. Sometimes you can be navigating in shark infested waters. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with this political climate that may be there? How do you navigate to see what's going on and how you're able to adapt to change? Laws change, different policies, different procedures, how it's executed, what you can do, what you can't do. We know that. We know the United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land. We know that and we understand that. But then when you come down to certain things, it's going to adhere to it, but different ways on how you can do it, because robbery in one state may vary for robbery to another state. Professional development is so important as a leader, and to stay current on the new research, the new data, what is taking place, how do you execute it, what are you doing, and of course networking and collaboration, a global perspective, what's happening in another state, what's happening in another country, all of these different things, the different educational components that are there. And as a leader, you have to have a vision. You have to have a different mindset. Your decisions should be evidence-based and data-driven. That should be a part of it when you are looking at these different things and have an eye on what's going on. I will stop there, Chris.
All right. Thank you, Oscar. Okay, Assistant Chief Easton. So your rise to the ranks coincided with your academic journey. How has your education influenced your leadership and the way you approach policing within the UVA community?
Yeah, so for me, it has, I'll start with it's taught me to be more understanding. And what I mean by that is, everybody has things going on. We've all got things going on. I worked on my education while I was working, so I was pretty busy for a while. And I now understand that even better that, everybody's got things going on. Everybody has things, whether it be education, family, whatever it is. I have a better understanding of that because when I was working on mine, I was, just had a lot going on. Um, as far as I approach policing, I feel like I can engage with the community a little better. It seems like there's more I can talk about with people. I feel more confident. I understand more. I'm not afraid to ask questions if I don't know. As weird as it may sound, I didn't used to ask a lot of questions. I was afraid it would reveal how dumb I was, and I wouldn't ask questions. And now I look at things different, and I'll ask the questions, and I realize that everybody's got questions. If you don't ask them, you're not going to learn. I always knew that, but I didn't really buy into that personally. So I look at things different. I try to instill that into everybody that I encounter, especially those that I lead. Um, so it's especially important for our people to understand why we as an agency or we as a profession are doing something. So you got to ask questions. You got to understand why you're doing that. Um, as far as how I approach policing, I ask more questions. Uh, it's I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I also tend to explain things more thoroughly. I get in trouble with my wife at home sometimes. She tells me I talk too much. When explaining something, she says, land the plane, whatever that means. It's when I'm explaining something, when I'm telling her how to do something, You know, she says land the plane. So anyway, you know, I just try to be, I try to explain things better and try to be transparent. So I think that's how it's helped me.
Yeah, thank you very much. So this is a general question for everyone. As I'm uh, reading off this question, I'll begin with you, Chris, just in a minute. Considering today's challenges from community relations to rapidly evolving technology, technology is not my friend all the time. I totally get this. How essential is higher education in preparing officers? Are there alternative approaches we should consider in addition to this traditional degree program process? I'll start with you, Assistant Chief Easton.
So, what was the question again? I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
So what we're looking at is how essential is higher education in preparing our officers, or maybe you know, is there an alternative approach that we should be considering beyond just a professional degree process?
So I think it's I think education is extremely essential. Education influences culture within departments, you know, in a positive way. You know, police professionals are not only colleagues. I talked about this earlier. They're friends outside of work. You know, I think culture is when education is a topic between police officers that are talking amongst themselves outside of work, they they support each other. How many times have police officers or just anybody in general talked about, you know, they could be talking whether it's you know, at dinner with friends if they're out or something, and education comes up and somebody says, yeah, I need to go back to school, I'm halfway there, or I need to, you know, I've always wanted to go to school, or something like that. And people then start, you know, then somebody might say, well, I went to school and I did this, you know. So now you've got a support system. So as far as you know, ways to in I don't know. I just think that you know, the support system with within the department for is a great culture.
All right, thank you. You know, so as you talk about culture, and we have a question in the chat that I'll come back to regarding culture. But you know, one of the things that you were just talking about reminded me that when I was in graduate school, I remember. So I was in policing for a number of years, and then started graduate school in sociology. And one of the things that I greatly appreciated in the program was nobody in my cohort or in the school were police officers, and not one of them thought like a police officer. And they challenged my paradigm of, you know, the world around me. You know, when I thought about, you know, this idea of culture, I was being acclimated to a complete different culture, and saw that as an opportunity to grow. Dr. Odom, let me move to you. Okay, so we're talking about higher education in the process of preparing officers, or what other alternatives should be considered in addition to the, you know, these traditional degree programs?
Okay, first, let me say I'm an avid supporter of getting a degree. education, no doubt about it. I've seen as being a police officer myself and working and then going back to school and getting finishing my degree, going to law school while I was a cop. I seen the impact, the vision, the critical skills, the analytical skills to be able to look at things in a different way, to be able to combine theory and practice. I thought it was unbelievable, and I did it, and I highly recommend it. And I think it helps to change and transform the profession, the vision, how we handle things, how we look at things, because there's so much from education that you could pull out from there. And that's why the military, which I'm a veteran, when you was an officer in the military, you had to have a college degree, minimum of a 4-year college degree to be an officer in the United States military. And I was an officer. You had to have that. They didn't care what it was in, but you had to have a minimum because of the training, the skills to be able to function, to be able to take exams, to be able to study, to get different viewpoints. Because as you know, in college, when you get your bachelor's degree, you're taking English, you're taking math, you're taking social science, you're taking psychology. All of those things contribute to your thinking and your functioning as a human being. I think if there's something alternative, I would say would be some sort of online learning or group learning, or as we would do in a police department, we would have certain things where we would have different borough-based training, or they will have time that they would cut out from the schedule and say, okay, for this half an hour, you go ahead and you're going to get this different type of training, or education, or different components to go over certain things so you can learn this. This is the newest thing. This is the vision. This is, different things like now how they deal with mental health is a big thing in policing, to have somebody come there and educate you and talk about the different principles, different ways how to address these issues. Online learning or some sort of borough-based training in addition to that education, because you're never going to be able to take that away. And you're never, if you're any aspirations of making change and being a police chief someplace, you're not going there without a college degree. Point blank. There's no police department in the country that is hiring, as you can look in IACP, PERF, whatever, to say, come be a police chief. You don't even need a high school diploma. So that's not happening. So you're definitely going to need this. And the skills that you get from this stays with you for life, the different ways how you look at it. Like I said, from sociology, psychology, math, all of those different things, even music. I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you, Oscar. So, Professor Brooks, I'll leave that question out there that we just were talking about in case you want to approach it from that angle. But maybe I can twist it up just a little bit for you. In your book, Tangled Up in Blue, you talk about the Police for Tomorrow Fellowship Program. And I found that really interesting because it's really not a traditional academic approach to education. Education means a lot of things to different people. Doesn't have to be in a classroom per se. So can you tell us more about that program and how it helps officers grow through that process?
Yeah, and I would emphasize again, I think, Oscar is of course right that we live in a world which values degrees, and it is hard to advance beyond a certain level if you don't have them. But as I said earlier, fan as I am of education, critical as I think it is, I also think that that's a shame, because I don't think having a fancy degree either guarantees that somebody's going to be smart and thoughtful and creative, nor does not having a degree mean that they're not smart and creative and so on. My granddad, who was himself a first generation college student, started out working in the copper mines in Butte, Montana. He eventually got a bachelor's of science and a PhD in metallurgy. And he always referred to the initials BS PhD after his name as standing for, bullshit piled high and deep. And we all know people who have, 6 degrees that are total idiots and jerks. And we know people, and I'm sure you can all think of officers you've worked with who didn't finish high school, and are the most thoughtful, interesting, creative people and really, really effective. So I actually kind of hate it that we've set as the criteria for advancement, something that can be kind of arbitrary. And I do believe that there are ways to bring out, to foster, to encourage that side that we all have that wants to ask questions and be creative and be self-reflective without having to jump through the hoops that make up higher education in the United States. The Police for Tomorrow Fellowship is a program that is a joint effort between Georgetown Law and the DC Metropolitan Police Department. And in some ways, it really kind of came out of my own experiences at the academy, feeling like, wow, there's this kind of untapped desire on the part of recruits to be talking about things that we're not talking about in the academy, et cetera. How do we build on that? How do we put these bright, idealistic people in rooms where they can have those hard conversations, where they can talk to scholars, where they can talk to community members, where they can talk to people who will challenge them, as well as people who will support them and have hard conversations. And program couldn't have gotten started without the really vital role played by Ben Heyman, now the executive director at the UVA, the Center for Public Safety and Justice, who was at the time both a reserve officer himself in MPD, and also was, I think at the time, he was the special assistant to the chief, and he later became chief of staff for the department. So it's a program that basically we've done 4 cohorts that each lasted about 18 months. We take a small group of MPD officers, usually relatively early career, and they spend time at Georgetown, both in the classroom and sometimes on expeditions. We've taken them to neighborhood walking tours, to the DC jail, to homeless shelters, et cetera. And they have those hard conversations about what is policing for? What does it mean? How do we know what's good, what's effective, what isn't? What about all these criticisms that community members are voicing? How should we think about these issues? What does it mean to police in a just way in a world, even in a world that is full of injustice and is full of inequality? What should the role of police officers be? Is following the law enough to make you a good police officer, or is there something different or something more? What responsibility do officers have? And it's a program that has always run on a shoestring. We've never had funding for it, so it's been kind of it's always a little bit of struggle to keep it going. But it's been kind of amazing. We get the most amazing conversations, and it's really interesting. I mean, I think sometimes frustrating to the department, which saw it as a leadership development tool and a retention tool. Some of our best and brightest fellows have ended up leaving the department. Some to go elsewhere, to go other departments or, to federal law enforcement, but some because they decided, maybe I want to be a social worker or whatever. And I think from the MPD's perspective, that feels like, well, wait a minute, this is crazy. We don't want these people to kind of go through this and then leave. From my perspective, it's all good, right? If they stay in the department, they become leaders, as some of them have. That's fantastic. To have these people who are really thoughtful, who have a network of other officers, former fellows who are really thoughtful, who can talk to each other and exchange ideas. But if some of them end up leaving and they become citizens who are themselves really thoughtful, who ask the right questions, who are knowledgeable, who can push for reforms in appropriate and constructive ways, like that's great too. But obviously I'm not the police chief, so it's easy for me to say, but it's really been incredibly inspiring. And I think it sort of goes to that point of our fellows have been quite diverse. Some of them have had master's degrees before they came into our program. Some of them got their GEDs. They've had really different experiences. They come from different racial, ethnic, religious, cultural, geographic backgrounds, et cetera. But it's kind of magic to see them sitting together and arguing with each other and supporting each other and arguing with professors and arguing with community members and supporting them. Something kind of magic does happen. And I do think that the program, and I think that the leadership within the Metropolitan Police Department would say this, has also led to some innovation within the department. There have been things that have come. We usually bring the chief comes and talks to the fellows at the end of the program. And as you know, police departments are super hierarchical. So typically a patrol officer is not getting any FaceTime with the chief, is not getting an opportunity to say, hey, chief, I've got some thoughts on how this department could be better. And we create that opportunity. And, sometimes our fellows come up with ideas that are sort of goofy or not practical and can't really be implemented. Sometimes they kind of annoy the chief. They're like, you need to do this. And the chief's like, yeah, no. But there have also been times where they've come up with ideas where the chief's been like, you know what? That's a really good or not, that's a good idea. Let's do that. Including some changes in the academy curriculum that came out of the feedback that our fellows gave to previous chiefs. And I think that part of changing police cultures, is really thinking about, well, how do we make this department a learning organization, and recognizing that, as with the military, you can't have every line officer all the time second guessing everything, right? You do need them to be like, look, sorry, this is the rule, deal with it. When your sergeant says you got to do it this way, that's not the time and place, unless he's actually committing a crime or something, for you to be like, well, yeah, but sergeant, I had this other idea. No, but you need to create some opportunities for those conversations to take place. Otherwise, you're going to fail to make use of the energy, the ideas, the insights of line officers, who often are the ones, they're closest to the ground. They are often the ones who can say, hey, this thing that seemed like a great idea, if you're in the chief's office or the mayor's office, it's not working. But here's this other thing that could potentially be really transformative, and how do you create the space within a department to have those conversations, and to make sure that you're tapping into the energy and the insights of the line officers, and they don't feel like, as going back to what Chris said, they don't feel like, well, they're not allowed to ask questions because then they might seem dumb, or they're not allowed to express ideas because then they might seem like they're being insubordinate or something. That the last thing you want if you're a chief is a department where everybody's just like, yes, sir. You want a department where at the right time, people know that the moment is to say, yes, sir, but that they also have a lot of opportunities and are encouraged to say, yes, but, yes, and, or yes, but how about if we tried it this way? Because that's what makes any organization, whether it's police department, or university faculty, any organization, that's what makes you better.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think some of the things that you were saying, allows for, this idea of speaking truth to power in a safe environment. As a chief, I recognize that employees don't necessarily feel comfortable or empowered to have, an honest conversation. Now, notwithstanding, the union folks, they always had a voice, and it was usually the loudest voice, but not maybe the most productive voice. But what you're sharing is an absolute opportunity to address culture within an organization, where you can have these ongoing dialogues that when it's not a critical incident that you just follow orders, but it's like looking to the future of the organization, and then how we engage with one another and how we engage better with our community. That's tremendous. So I appreciate you sharing that experience with us. So I'm going to pause here just for a moment, and just remind the audience that if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. And with that, before I go on to my next question, I'm going to take this from the chat, and it's rather long. So as I've read through it, I'm going to get to where I think is the question to the panel. So it's asking, what's your view as the best way to impact an organization's culture, quote, with regards to expectations for their police officers? And then this follow-up to it, which I think might be important to this conversation. And this has to do, what are the strategies for mid-level police supervisors or supervision can extend to guide or motivate younger officers toward enrolling in educational programs? So what is it that, like, leaders, that mid-level leaders, how can we mentor culturally within our organization? And I'll open that up to whoever wants to take on this question.
I'll jump first. And one of the things that I look at about, as you know, I'm avid supporter and belief in education. And I go back to years ago, there was this book called The Millionaire Next Door. And it was the #1 seller on the New York Times bestseller list. And in that book, it said millionaires are 5 times more likely than the average person to have their kid go to medical school, 4 times more likely than the average person to have their kids go to law school, and 3 times more likely than the average person to have their kids go to get an MBA, which once again shows how education is valued, even by those with money. And the reason it wasn't for them so that they could get money, but it was what the education, what they said in the book, what the education did as far as their thinking, their vision, and how they look at certain things. And policing is growing. This, we're in 21st century policing, and I would say to the younger officers, bringing to them or let them know about different conferences, different things that are online and in person, and shows the importance of it, and also it helps to improve them in how they view things, how they view the world, because generational shifts have changed in policing on how you look at things, how you do things. More of the ability, community oriented stuff, to talking to different analytical skills, and showing them how it helps to change them, helps them to improve, and also promotional opportunities, also different assignments that they can get, of course, with education, because certain assignments require different skill sets in certain educations. And I'm speaking on based on what I've learned when I was in NYPD, to go into different assignments and different things of that nature, and how it just changes you as a person itself and your thinking. And then also with this, it shows them, you being a role model and showing this to them so that they could do it. And then they could do it with other officers. And sometimes it takes one to take that leap of faith in order to do it. And then once you see one, then they do it. And one of the things they did for us was in certain precincts, they had the people from the different universities come there and establish satellite campuses. So it made it easier for them so that they didn't have to travel, so they didn't have to worry about other things, to bring that there for them, because they had that interest. And a lot of times they're peaking, but it's a matter of bringing it to them and also showing them how it can improve them. And one thing, and I'll stop with that, there used to be the saying that says, VP or PhD, some titles last forever, right? And so when you have that education, that stays with you forever. And one day you will retire from the police department. You can't stay there forever. There's age limits, there's different things you're going to leave. And when you leave, what do you want to do? How do you possibly want to give back, contribute, and or do something else? And that's when you have the experience in that education, which is basically that passport or ticket to go into someplace else to teach, or university or training, if that's so your choice of desire. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you. Anyone else want to address the question?
Yeah,
No pressure.
I'll just a couple of things. I think the biggest thing is support. If I'm thinking back to the question is mid-level management and what's the best thing they can do. Support is supporting your people. That is in my mind one of the biggest and most influential things that you can do. And support looks different. I mean, it can look in so many. It can look like so many different things. And I was in a training one time, and one of the things that I learned, or a saying that just stuck with me, is never kill a try. And that just stuck with me. Um, so that in my mind is a great support that you can show your people when somebody is trying, and when some we fail. So the most successful people in the world have failed at most things that they've tried at, and then that one thing or those two things or whatever that they've succeeded at is what brought them to where they are. So if you support them, being mid-level management, you can only do so much as far as speaking on behalf of the department. Going back to Professor Brooks, what she was talking about earlier, that is, that's kind of a administrative thing, like what can we do as an agency to make opportunities available from an agency standpoint. But I think the more broad answer for that is support. That's the biggest thing, is just supporting your people.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Brooks,
Yeah.
I don't want to cut you off.
No, I know we're just about out of time. The only thing I'd add
No,
is
we
that,
got plenty of time. We got half hour.
oh, we do. Okay. I thought we were about to end. Good. Okay, then I'll just ramble on for a bit. No, I mean, I think that making sure that that support is concrete too is critical. Because I do think their departments kind of talk the talk and say, yeah, we value this and so on, but then they don't actually make it easy for people. And so sometimes that just goes to things as simple as, can you figure out how to build in flexibility in scheduling, for instance, so that people who want to either take classes part-time or even take a leave of absence for a year can do that, right? And a lot of departments are really rigid about those things. So it becomes very, very hard in practice, even if the department says, oh yeah, we love it if you do this, it becomes really hard in practice for them to do that, especially if they're also juggling family responsibilities and so on. That departments can choose to make it, they can ease that path. They can ease it with financial incentives. They can ease it with subsidies. They can ease it with scheduling flexibility. They can ease it by showing that then when you come back and you've got this, they are going to value it, or they can make it a lot harder in practice for people to go ahead and pursue education. So I guess that's all I would add to that.
Oh, thank you very much. So we have a couple more questions in the chat. And so I'll go there versus going to my next question, because these are the questions that our audience wants answered. So in this first one, it's set up. So Germany has a 2.5-year police academy that runs similarly to a college. Would this be a solution? And then they talk about, or the ROTC model, we give you 4 years of school with limited service during this time, but you owe X amount of years afterwards. So the question is, could these models work for policing, or is there no appetite to invest in this type of education?
Yes,
Anyone
those
want
models
to take
can
a-
work for policing. In NYPD, they have the Police Cadet Corps. And what happens with the Police Cadet Corps, while you're going through college, you're getting training also. And then when you graduate, you go right into the police department. So it sets up like a model where you're getting your education, you're getting training, they're paying for your college also and giving you a stipend. And then you go right into the police department and you have a commitment of something like 4 or 5 years to do that. So I think it's absolutely could work as a model to do that. Also, within the academy in NYPD, someone who say doesn't have a bachelor's degree, but they had, the credit requirements after graduating from the police academy there, you are awarded, because of the education that you get while you're there, you're awarded 36 college credits. So now whatever other college credits you now have 36 college credits added on from going through that training, and then you can go to school and just further the rest and complete your bachelor's degree. So different avenues or roads like that, I think, are good. They're instrumental, and this is a way to encourage people to do this, and also at the same time further their education, not only for the police departments, but also for themselves personally, to benefit them. Because as we all can attest to, education, we have learned things. When you go to school, when you go to college, you learn something whether you want to or not. You don't know everything. None of us, when we went to college, and still we don't know everything. And when we were in college, we learned something new that we did not know before.
Thank you, Oscar. Anyone else want to address that one?
There have been historically some efforts to get through Congress legislation that would create a sort of funded police program where if students committed to essentially like a ROTC, and they haven't succeeded in the past. This doesn't seem like a particularly auspicious moment to think they're going to happen right now, given current national political realities. But I do think, thinking about it longer term, I mean, I personally would love to see a real meaningful national service program, really well funded, that in which both military service, policing, teaching, and a whole range of other things were options, both for young people, but also for people who are early and mid-career as well, and even retired people, and I would see that, it would be super expensive. It's super expensive to do it well. If you really want to incentivize people to go into what are essentially service positions, whether it's the military or policing or teaching, you have to invest, and that means tax money and so on. And I've always thought, could there be a better investment, in this country, than to invest in creating people who do things that benefit all of us, and indeed who, I mean, there could be infrastructure, come on, whatever. That's a whole other conversation about national service and what would it cost, how would it be funded. I think it is absolutely feasible, and I wish that we had elected officials who had both the vision and the sort of guts and commitment to make it happen, because I think it would be so good for the country. I also think one of the many reasons it would be so good for the country, going back to the us them challenge, right, is that things that encourage people who wouldn't normally think about policing as a career to think about it are really good things. I mean, one of the things that's great about even programs like the DC Reserve program, as with the military reserve program, which military reserve is, it's a way to get skills that are kind of not necessarily resident in the career military, and that you don't necessarily need all the time, but you really need sometimes, and to get perspectives, the citizen soldier perspective into the institution. And similarly with police officers, that to have sort of citizen officers who maybe they're only doing police work, 5 days a month, and the rest of the time they're engineers, they're IT people, or they're electricians or whatever. Like, you actually really want that's part of both bringing in innovation and other perspectives, and it's part of having them be back in their communities as ambassadors, as people who can talk to their neighbors and family members about policing. And I think that kind of national service program would also have that effect, of bringing in people who wouldn't otherwise think of it and sending them back out again in really interesting ways. The European model, in which it's a slightly separate issue, maybe, where if you're Canadian or you're British, you're not necessarily just going to a regular university and being an English major or a biology major or whatever, and then going to policing, but you're actually spending 2 or 3 years in the sort of the police. Imagine the police academy goes on for 3 years and is combined with what looks much more like kind of liberal artsy types of classes. I think that's also a really viable and interesting model. But again, it's expensive. It requires a real investment in people. And I think it would require creativity in thinking about how you recruit people who are atypical police recruits to make that level of commitment, which also just takes money as well. So there are real financial barriers, but I do think that finding ways, I mean, as everybody here knows, the inconsistencies in the US in police training and education and how departments are structured, creates real problems. So you have some departments that are incredibly professionalized, some that, people are really getting quite minimal training for 6 weeks or something, and then there they are with the badge and the gun, and that doesn't always work out so great, right? So finding ways to kind of professionalize education and have a more quality control and more consistency across states and localities, I think would be a really good thing.
It's great. I was thinking as you were talking there that someone used to share that, one of the most visible faces of government are police officers. We see them every day. How often do you see your mayor? Right? Maybe you get a glimpse of them at some event in passing if you ever attend that. But police officers are always present in the community. And every time that we see events occur that are of a negative nature, have a negative outcome, police are generally involved. And then there's all this discussion about what we should be doing with policing, which gets to your point. Like, at when do we invest really in policing? Who becomes, the face of policing in those opportunities? Thank you for sharing that. So this next one in the chat, a little bit long, but I think it's the person's asking for maybe some guidance that, within their organization, their officers are working extensively, and, where is this opportunity that, they're tired? How can they be supported? What are some ideas that you could share that may be unique to their situation that would encourage officers to continue their education? And I know a number of us in policing, at least as a policing background, continued our education while we were raising families and working full time and trying to juggle all those things. Maybe there's some idea from the panel. How did you manage this? How could managers? What are some suggestions to police managers that would be able to support officers in their ability to continue education?
Well, I
And
would
I'll
say,
open it to the floor.
I would say, of course, it's nice when leadership buys in so that they can support the officers. But like myself and plenty of you, we worked full time, went to school, raised a family at the same time. And one of the things I always say to the students, time management is also critical. And one of the things the testers I used to always tell them is that there's 24 hours in a day. There's no one thing that you do for 24 hours. And one of the things for yourself, I would always say, write down, I would have them do a week or 2 week assignment in addition to write down everything that you do for all the 24 hours so you can account for the time. And then when you look at that, you'll get an idea of where you have time, can make time, or look at time, as opposed to just saying, I don't have any time, right? So document it and look at it. And then also certain times I always say, how bad do you want it? What sacrifices are you willing to make in order to get this? Because everything is not going to just be put out there for you. Life is hard, but it's fair, right? And so with these different things that are out there, you have to look at also yourself, your own commitment. How bad do you want it? And then you start strategizing from there. Don't let anybody else stop your dreams or your hopes or something that you want to do. And of course, leadership needs to buy in and realize the value of education and supporting their officers and going back to school. One of the things that I did when I was a chief was people who applied and was going to undergrad and grad school, we tried to find time and to be able to accommodate their schedules or put them in assignments so that they would be able to go to school, and also help to look for programs that were accommodating to the type of schedules that they were on. So it takes buy-in from leadership to do it. And when you get leadership involved in it, then it's great. And then other times, if you're having issues or troubles, as I always tell people, don't let anybody else stop your dreams. Find ways, look at it, look at your schedule, do a self-reflection, look at those 24 hours in a day and see what you're doing, where you have time, and when there is the possibility for you to achieve your goals. Don't let anybody stop your dreams.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just add to that, and for me, it goes a little deeper. Each individual person has to want it. They have to want it, not just for, you know, this is my own opinion, my own thought. They have to want it for themselves. It can't just be you know, I want this for my career. I want this for, you know, for another reason. It's got to be, they have to want it because going back to what Dr. Odom said, you know, there are 24 hours and, you know, I didn't even do that. When I was going through, I didn't have to look at the 24 hours. I didn't have to look at when do I have time to do it. I just made it happen because it was something that I wanted. I wanted to do it. And so, you know, if somebody is in it for the wrong reasons and you know, I don't want to discourage or you know, but if somebody's you know, going to school for the wrong reasons, I think there's a higher chance that they're not going to finish. There's a higher failure. Uh, you know, it's just they have to want it, and they have to. You know, the drive has to be there. Again, it can't be for the wrong reasons.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
sorry, I'm you know, I'm mid thought there. For me, there was I had support systems all over the place. My agency was very supportive. You know, at home, my wife, my you know, everything was there. It was like the perfect storm. But the biggest thing was that I made it happen, and that's what people need to, you know, that's the biggest thing is an individual, and they need to make it happen. If they want it, they're going to make it happen.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we got about 10, 11 minutes left. I want to go into this closing round, which will provide you each an opportunity to share a final thought. So I listened to Larry Bernstein's podcast, and he always ends with this, like, what are you optimistic about? So I want to finish with this. So in 1 to 2 minutes, what are you optimistic about regarding the future of how education can shape policing? And so with this, I'm going to begin with Professor Brooks.
Oh boy. So I'm not actually super optimistic at this moment in time. I mean, as I said, I think that we're at a moment when we're seeing some attacks on higher education, on the sort of the fundamental mission of higher education, which is to bring together people from different backgrounds and ask hard questions. I think we're sort of at an intolerant political moment, and that is really threatening to this whole enterprise. And I think the messages that we're getting, the national level messages we're getting about policing, are also pretty hostile to that whole effort to get people to think differently and creatively. So I'm not super optimistic at this exact moment. That being said, I think if we can struggle through this, you know, sort of what doesn't kill us makes us strong, right? I think that there are some fair questions being raised about the role of universities and education that you know, if we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to mix metaphors here, might end up strengthening our ability for higher education to be responsive to the needs of everyday Americans in all professions. You know, that I do think higher ed, as I said earlier, it's gotten sort of too specialized. We start believing our own hype a little too much. We start believing like, hey, I write a bunch of articles with a lot of footnotes and big words, and that means I'm a really smart person, and you're probably not as smart as me, which just pushes people away and doesn't do a service to anybody, you know, at all. And I do think that if we come out of this, if we can come out of this with people who work in higher ed being willing to re-examine our own assumptions about what is valuable, how we really, that we should be seeing higher education as a public service. And that means that you know, we need to be more creative and more flexible ourselves in thinking about formats, types of teaching, types of learning, types of assessing people that are non-traditional, and that value lived experience and practical skills, as well as valuing the ability to, you know, be good at exams or write good papers all the time. I do think that there's a possibility that this difficult period could have a healthy shaking up effect long term if we don't throw that baby out with the bathwater. And I guess the other thing that does make me, hopeful, despite what I said about feeling like is this a challenging time, and some of the messages we're getting from on high about policing scare me. Because they go in the opposite direction of saying be empathetic, think hard about the role of policing in a diverse society, think critically. But is that I do see kind of a demand signal from ground level officers, that I think that the last decade of public debates, yes, it has made some people just feel defensive and just feel like, okay, you're mean to me. You don't understand the challenges I face as a police officer. You're always saying that policing is bad. Well, I don't want to talk to you. I don't care. It's had that effect on some people, but it's also had an effect on other people, making say, gosh, there's some stuff in that critique that I think is wrong, but there's some stuff that I think is fair. And I want to grapple with that. I want to talk about that. And that demand signal, I think, bubbles up to the leadership level as well. And that's the most hopeful thing of all, right? That I think there is a real desire on the part of many, not just police leaders, but also line level officers to say, we want to do this right. We don't want people to hate us. We came into this because we thought we were doing a public service and we want to protect and serve. And boy, we want to respond to this, and we want to work with communities to figure out how to do well, and how to be responsive. And so that makes me optimistic that I hope and trust that whatever happens in just the next few years, that those kinds of conversations, both at the sort of from the top down level, but also from the bottom up, will actually continue both in policing and in higher education.
All right. Thank you. So you found optimism there. Thank you.
Working on it.
All right. Assistant Chief Easton, what are you optimistic about?
Yeah, so I think there's a bright future. I think education is we're all humans, and we all share, whether you're police, whether you are, whatever you're doing, whatever your profession is, you're a police officer, you teach school, you're a plumber, whatever it is, we all have families. We all have favorite foods. We all have pets. We all have, whatever it is, we're all human. And that's something that it seems to be forgotten about, especially when there's, something that happens when one police officer makes a bad choice, and, the entire country's up in arms about the profession of law enforcement. We're all human. And I think there needs to be more human to human interactions. And, I don't want to, not so much cop to citizen interactions. And I think a good way to do that is through education. When you are, if we talk about just in classes, when you are in actual learning, whether it be online or in person, chances are, and I talked about this earlier, where police officers and law enforcement officers learn and train together and only together. But if they venture out into higher education, then they're going to be with other people who are not in law enforcement. So it's just humans learning together. They're learning about each other. And cops don't stop being cops when they're when they're off duty. They are who they are. So when you're talking to somebody, and I remember the classes that I went through, and you had to give an introduction, you had to say what you did, or you had to, and granted, you could give as little or as much as you want, but I always talked about my profession and what I did. And so my point is, there just needs to be more human to human action or interactions instead of, again, cop to citizen. And I think if we have more of that, it would there would be more acceptance. It would break down the us versus them, like I talked about earlier. Um, I think education also helps with, people who are educated, I think are more motivated. They are, and this is just in general, doesn't go for everybody, but they tend to be more motivated. They're more outgoing. Like for me, it helped me. I feel more confident asking questions. I don't know that I'm any smarter. I'm probably still dumb, but I still ask questions. So um, I think education is a great thing. The brain is one of the most important tools. Police officers need tools just like everybody else, and the brain is the most important tool. We need to sharpen it. We need to keep it sharp.
All right. Thank you. All right, Oscar, you have 1 minute.
Okay.
What are you optimistic about?
I agree with what my colleagues were saying. And as the chief just said just now, I always say, we used to say the wise ask why and the rest just guess. So if you don't know something, it would be wise of you to ask why and make sure you continue to ask why to make sure that you understand. Policing is a noble profession and they must rise to the occasion of the 21st century and be able to adapt to the different challenges and changes. The public wants and deserves better policing and also better educated police officers. And I would say the FBI, the Secret Service, the CIA, the DEA, the Diplomatic Service, the U.S. Marshals, all require at a minimum a 4-year bachelor's college degree. No matter how smart you are or think you are, they require that you have a 4-year degree. And I will end on that note.
All right. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panel members, Professor Brooks, Dr. Odom, Assistant Chief Easton. I greatly appreciate your thoughtful contributions to this discussion. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Before we leave, I have one brief announcement. So next month, our panel series is Rethinking Police Culture and Leadership. This panel discussion is hosted virtually by Dr. Tom Bradshaw. This will take place on June 10th. So please be sure to look for the registration link, which should be out shortly. And with that, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.